In this lab, I'm going to cover the walkthrough for the first of our 2 Lambda labs. And this one involves Lambda functions, IAM roles, and EC2. So I'll get started by clicking on Services and then finding Lambda and then creating my function. So the first goal was to create a Lambda function using any runtime I want. So I'm going to give this a name, and I'll just call it Lab1. For the runtime, I'm going to choose Python 3.6. And then for the role, we're going to need a specific role in order to be able to instantiate and terminate those EC2 instances. But for now, I'm just going to choose any of the roles that are available to me. We'll worry about changing it shortly. Next, I'll create function. Now that we have the function created, our second step was to give the Lambda full EC2 access and full CloudWatch access. So in a new tab, let's open Identity and Access Management and create the role that we're going to need. So I'll hit Create Role. And then for the trusted entity, I'm going to choose Lambda because I want Lambda functions to be able to assume this role. And of course, this page has all of our managed policies. And we're going to want to find 2, full EC2 access and full CloudWatch access. So EC2 full and CloudWatch full. There we go. That'll give any Lambda function that assumes this role full access to both CloudWatch and EC2. The role name, I'll just call it Lambda EC2 CloudWatch full. And I'll create that role. And now that that's created, let me reload my Lambda function. And I'll scroll down to where I can change the role. And I'll choose the role that I just created and save that function. While I'm down here, I definitely want to change this timeout because if it sticks at 3 seconds, then I'm most likely going to end up timing out. So let me change that just to something greater. There we go. 5 minutes, why not? We'll save that again. Now that we've created a Lambda function using any runtime we want, and we've used an IAM role to give the Lambda full EC2 access and full CloudWatch access, the last step is to have the Lambda either launch or terminate an EC2 instance depending on the parameters passed. Next, I want to implement the logic that's going to accept a parameter and either create an instance or terminate an instance. So it's going to look something like this. And similarly, if I pass in terminate, then I want to terminate the instance instead. Now that we have the logic in there, now we'll need to insert the command from our SDK. So for Boto3 to create an instance, it looks like this. And then to terminate an instance, it looks like this. And of course, for Python, I'll need to import Boto3. Now, notice for Boto3, we're missing a couple of pieces of information that we're going to need. In the create instances, it's asking for an image ID or an AMI image ID. So let's go to our EC2 dashboard in a new tab real quick and grab just any AMI. Go to Launch Instance. And then one of my favorites is Amazon Linux 2, so I'll grab this AMI ID right here, copy that into my clipboard, and I'll pass that in as the AMI ID. And then next, EC2 terminate instance, and it's asking for the instance IDs that we want to terminate. let's assume that we want to pass in an instance ID in our event. So I'll do this. Event instance ID. And of course, there are things we can do to make this code look prettier, but we're not concerned with that for now. Oh, I do want to change this though, max count to 1, because I definitely don't want to spin up more than one instance. Anyway, let's save this and test it out. And we have a success message. So hopefully if I reload the dashboard, there it is. I see one instance spinning up. While it's doing that, let's get ready to test terminating our instance with Lambda. So I'm going to copy the instance ID and recall that if we want to terminate it, we also need to pass in an instance ID. So let's configure our test event to terminate. And we'll give it an instance ID equal to the instance that we just spun up. So while that instance finishes creating, I'm going to place this video on a brief pause, and we'll be right back with you. And it looks like that instance is done instantiating, so let's give this a tag so I recognize it. Doomed instance, because we are about to delete you. Back to Lambda, and recall that we just configured our test event to pass the action as terminate instead of create, and to include the instance ID. So let's give this a shot. And we'll test it out. And we got a success message, so let's go back to our EC2 dashboard. And sure enough, our doomed instance is shutting down. So in this lab, we created a Lambda function using any runtime we want. We used IAM roles to give the Lambda function full EC2 access and full CloudWatch access. And then we had the Lambda both launch and terminate an EC2 instance depending on the parameters that we passed to it. If all of that made sense to you, then feel free to move on.